Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Automata podcast. I'm John Southurst from bitsonline.com, and with me is Daniel Corey from Pactum Capital. Hey Daniel.
Hey, everybody.
We're going to bring you all the latest news from the automated economy, which is blockchain, cryptocurrencies, digital assets, and the glue that holds it all together. Some of this will make your head spin. So today, Daniel, our guest is Brit Yonge from the Stellar Project. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, sure thing. So, Jed was the founder of the Stellar Protocol, Jed McCaleb, and he's been in the crypto scene for quite a while.
Yeah, can you tell us about Jed a little for the uninformed?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so Jed, really interesting guy, and I'm super lucky to be able to work with him every day. Uh, he went to Berkeley for a year and decided, hey, I actually already know how to program, so I'm good, and went off and kind of did his own thing. And one of his early projects was something called eDonkey 2000, which, if you were a file sharing nerd in the early 2000s, you probably remember eDonkey, and it was huge in Asia, kind of on the same scale as LimeWire and Napster.
Yeah, I
And
remember it
so
well.
yeah, and so he's really kind of ever since then really been deeply involved in distributed systems. So he did that, and then he went and created kind of the first Bitcoin exchange after reading obviously the white paper and getting very excited about Bitcoin. He immediately saw the need that you would have to there was a real market need for an exchange. So created the first Bitcoin exchange, sold it off to a guy who ended up running into the ground. And then he started a company called Ripple, and then left there and started a company called Stellar, which is really trying to build and think about um, how do you have a kind of an internet protocol for payments? In the same way that we have protocols for mail servers, we have SMTP. In the same way we have protocol for the internet, TCP/IP. How do we make cross-asset transfer, transactions of stores of value? How do we make that trivially cheap and very efficient and totally decentralized? And so that's really what Stellar is all about, is that kind of underlying glue that allows a decentralized transfer of value.
So just to clarify, I've always had this impression of Stellar as kind of a less bank and profit oriented version of Ripple. How accurate is that? Is it close or is it way off?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it certainly is very much a nonprofit, right? And there's a reason for that. I mean, look, if you're going to create an open source protocol, it makes a ton of sense that the governance of that should be a nonprofit, right? I mean, people don't want to adopt something as a community standard if they know that there's a for-profit entity behind it that it can one day kind of charge a bunch of money for it, or and bend everyone over the barrel because they now have a monopoly. And so, from a corporate structure perspective, yeah, sure. I mean, the way that we think about the way that Stellar thinks about managing the distribution of the lumen, the way they think about governance, it's very much thought of in a not-for-profit context, and not a creating value for shareholders context. And that's a lot of the culture.
So, Britt, let me ask you then, because there is some sort of for-profit component now, and you're a part of that. And could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that Jed did when he left Ripple was, he kind of saw that there was going to be some limitations in the way that that software was designed, and so he got together with a couple of guys and did a top-down rewrite, which is now the Stellar Protocol. And so, after it launched about a year ago, it became obvious that the market really wanted to do business with a corporate entity. And what I mean by that is, you can have a not-for-profit and you can have this open source code, but at the end of the day, there are businesses that want to do business with you, and they want to adopt the technology, and they want to have contracts with people that they can hold liable, and they want to have services, and there's a whole kind of component around around kind of productionizing and implementing the protocol, which is much better suited for a for-profit entity. And so that's really, where the impetus for Lightyear was, and really just kind of meeting that market need. And so, we focus really on the enterprise kind of implementation of Stellar. And so folks are much more kind of comfortable having a contract with a corporate entity than they are with a not-for-profit. It's just much more natural for them.
So, are you able to give us any info about active projects or clients you're working with at the moment?
Sure. So, the real early adopters in this space, I think, have shown to be non-bank financial institutions, and that's a buzzword that people talk about a lot. But just to kind of flesh it out a little bit, there's these companies called remittance companies, which are they're essentially companies that allow retail customers, usually on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, that want to send money from one country to another. And these companies, they play a really important role in the market. Primarily, their job is to provide the bank services that banks are unwilling to provide. Right. In this case, it's cross-border payment. And so these guys are kind of on the outs, are really in a disadvantaged position within the financial space, and that's shown to be a great kind of early adopter for us, and I think for a lot of new ideas with mobile payments and whatnot. And so our remittance companies you probably haven't heard of a lot of them. The biggest one in the world is Western Union, which you may have heard of. But basically, yeah, it's something from there. But there's thousands of these companies, and they're all really on the really outskirts of the financial system. And so providing infrastructure for them is a pretty big deal, because they really do need a tech transformation, and they need access to liquidity. So that's on the remittance side. We deal with a bunch of players. Tempo is one, CoinsPH, Flutterwave is one in Africa, Novati is one in Australia. And then on the upper side of the market, we've partnered with IBM to do outreach to larger financial institutions. IBM is just kind of in a position where they always have a great sales Rolodex. They do business with all the financial services firms today. And so we announced a partnership with them along with about 15 other banks, I want to say last month, maybe the month before. And that was a big deal. So some of the banks there are tier one banks, BBVA, TD Bank, CIBC, and then there's a few kind of tier 2 and tier 3 banks as well as a part of that. And so that's a huge deal, just to kind of have that market validation and get folks really looking at this as a way to send payments in an alternative construct to Swift, which is pretty cool.
So Stella's going to be working mainly in the background and dealing with the corporate entities like the banks and the payment processors and the remittance companies. Is that right? There's no consumer-oriented part of it?
Yeah, I mean, really, we live pretty far down the stack. If you think about kind of from a tech perspective, we are really at the protocol level, right? So we don't really have ambitions about being consumer-facing necessarily. We like where we are in providing infrastructure and being back-end guys. So it would be a great compliment to us if people were sending a bunch of money across the world and using Stellar and not even aware of that. I think we want to be the glue and thought of as like the internet standard for transferring value.
There is competition in this space when looking at cryptocurrencies. So what is it that makes Stellar different?
Sure. I mean, look, it's kind of purpose built for the cross asset transfer problem, and I'll explain what I mean by that. I mean, if you kind of once you read the Satoshi white paper, it's obviously like really cool, and you think, wow, it's this really great idea that I can have this counterparty-less store of value. every store of value in this world, every asset even has an implied counterparty. And so the idea that you can have a store of value that has no counterparty is a very, very big idea. But then when you think about how do you apply that to the financial world today, like how do you actually like kind of dovetail this thing into our everyday lives? Bitcoin kind of falls short in a couple of ways, and so from a kind of design principles perspective, the way that Jed kind of approached it was, hey, well, the first thing you need is you got to be able to represent other assets in this protocol. Bitcoin only knows about Bitcoin. It has no, kind of way to express other, assets. And so one of the things that Stellar allows you to do is very trivially, very easily represent other assets. And that's a huge part of just kind of interfacing with the rest of the world and interfacing with the world we live in today. And the second thing that you have to be able to do, I think is very important, is you have to be able to exchange and transfer these stores of value in a decentralized way. And my prediction for 2018 in the crypto space is that 2018 is going to be the year where everyone realizes that decentralized exchanges are a just absolutely essential component to realizing the vision of this entire movement. If you don't have a decentralized exchange, you basically go back into this world where now I'm having to trust this counterparty to exchange value, right? And that's no bueno. You sort of want to play out these principles of decentralization as much as possible. And so Stellar has this concept of a distributed exchange, which is literally like an order book that's executed by the network, which is a pretty cool idea, and something that we probably need to do a better job of talking about. And then the last piece, I think that's the real differentiator, is the consensus protocol. Also something that we don't really get enough credit for, and we need to do a better job of talking about. But there's just a certain kind of scale. There are certain scale requirements that you just have to be a production payment system in any real capacity. And again, not to disparage other protocols, but like if you're processing 10 or 20 or 30 transactions a second concurrently, that's just like not the scale that's necessary to support the financial systems as it exists today. So the Stellar Consensus Protocol was something that was created by one of Jed's friends, David Mazieres, who's a professor at Stanford, leads the distributed systems group there. And it kind of outlines a really cool way to kind of allow consensus to happen in a much scalable fashion. So and on the order of like thousands of transactions a second. And so and that's I think it's just kind of the reality of, if you want to have a production system, it's gotta hit those kind of numbers. So those are kind of the high level points I think that really differentiate us from other protocols. And depending where you sit, one of those might be more interesting than others, but it's all three of those things I think are pretty novel.
I heard you just mention the consensus protocol, and I wanted to clarify something about that. People often ask me this about Ripple. They say, is it actually a blockchain? Do you describe it as that, or is it more of a distributed ledger or something completely different?
Yeah, I mean, blockchain can mean a lot of different things. I prefer to use the word distributed ledger. I think that's just kind of, I think the mental image, it's just a better kind of set of words to help people understand what's going on. So much of what we do is education, right? And so if you kind of the visualization of a distributed ledger, I think when you say those words, it just kind of, I think it gets people on the right track. Where I think blockchain can be a little daunting as a mental construct. So I use the term distributed ledger. I just think it's more helpful for getting people to understand the concepts.
One of the long-term issues that most cryptocurrencies eventually have, if they get any level of adoption, is scaling. And you touched on it a little bit. Could you talk a little bit about what Stellar has done to deal with scaling and potential scaling problems in the future?
Yeah. I mean, it's actually something we think a lot about, and we spend a lot of time working on. I don't want to spoil anything, but we're about to publish a paper here at a big conference, and I think a lot of kind of what we do is trying to is just getting the network at a point where we know we can handle global scale. And so, yeah, there's just a lot of things. You want to scale the as far as like the axes that you care about. You care about the number of addresses, right? There's almost 10 billion people in the world, so you should be able to support that number of addresses. There's the transaction concurrency, right? So on Swift's like busiest day, they're processing probably 25 million transactions, and so that comes down to like I don't know 350 or so transactions a second. So you should be able to support at least that, probably more if you want to do domestic payments. And then obviously you got to excuse me, you have to care about like the number of nodes in the network, how many nodes can you support and whatnot. So nodes are kind of equivalent in this case, somewhat to like the number of assets in the network. So there's all sorts of different scale axes that you care about scalability and yeah, it's something that we care about a lot. I think we're very excited about Lightning Network. I think that's a really interesting. They've taken a really interesting direction in implementing kind of this concept of having a private channel. And yeah, not to spoil too much, but I think we're very excited about the steps we've taken to ensure that we can scale to really big numbers.
Excellent too. And can you explain a little about the role of the Lumens currency? Is it actually a currency? Do you call it that, or is it something else?
Yeah, we call it the native digital asset. It's the digital asset for the Stellar network, right? It's the oil that makes the Stellar network run.
Right.
It's not. I don't like currency because currency, our definition of currency up until pretty recently was it something that was issued by an entity, issued by a central bank or issued by even a person or whatever, a bank. At certain times in history, people have issued their own currency, right? But there's an excuse me, there's an implication of a counterparty when you use the term currency. And it's really important, I think, that people understand that lumens have no counterparty. It is a counterpartyless store of value, and that's a very important part of it. And the purpose that it serves is really to, there's all sorts of operations in the network that kind of that have some cost, right? If you have, if you have an open network, there's like kind of computational resources that are limited, right? Especially in an open distributed system. And so we charge like a very nominal, or the network charges a nominal kind of fee to do certain operations. And that's really as a mechanism to prevent spamming activity, right? We don't want people creating, billions of accounts, because that would be a bad experience for everyone, and you could essentially, DDoS the network. And so, yeah, lumens essentially act as this like oil that to do all these operations, you kind of need some nominal amount of lumens. It also is really useful for liquidity purposes. Essentially, this is going to be a little goofy to explain without a whiteboard, but imagine you had like 100 assets on a network. You're going to want to have liquidity between all those assets, and one way to kind of scale the liquidity in a better way is to have a kind of intermediary coin, an intermediary asset. So a bridge asset between all those 100 assets, and so Lumen kind of serves as that intermediary counterpartyless asset, which provides liquidity on the order book. Kind of hard to explain without a whiteboard, but hopefully that makes sense.
So I'm just looking over at CoinMarketCap now, and the price of lumens has really rocketed lately, like everything else. It's about 11 cents. And does that have any impact, like positive or negative, on the project, or is it just good attention for you?
Yeah, I'll be honest. I probably check the price maybe once a week, so it's news to me, I guess. Yeah, I think it's positive in the sense that it gets more people engaged in the project, and it gets more people to know about who we are. That's certainly very nice. I think in the same way that if you're at a public company, you probably shouldn't be checking the price of the company on listed on NASDAQ, whatever, every day. That's probably not healthy. I think it's kind of the same thing for folks that work here. We don't. I just don't think it's healthy to kind of think about that stuff every day. Um, uh, so certainly, it doesn't hurt as far as getting attention to the project, but I don't think frankly, it doesn't affect our day to day that much.
I've been to some hackathons and some other events where developers in particular, have shown me some interesting projects. Are you guys attracting a lot of third-party developers, or anybody that's interested in open source? Is that anything that you guys are trying to promote?
Yeah, absolutely. So I highly recommend any developers listening to this check out the Stellar Build Challenge. We run it it's continuously running, but basically if you build some stuff on top of Stellar, we excuse me, we reward the winners with some Lumen, and that's exciting for everybody. We want people to be motivated to build stuff on top of the network, and yeah, so that's been a lot of fun. I think we've got a long way to go in what we can do to kind of engage the developer community and get them excited about stuff they can build and whatnot. It's a really great platform to build stuff, especially if you're thinking about transferring value.
Can you talk a little bit about your professional background? And I know you touched on some of the stuff with Jed, but I guess before all this cryptocurrency stuff, before you got interested, what were you doing and what led you to this?
So I worked at a company called Palantir for 5 years, which was like a data analytics company based in Silicon Valley. And for a good portion of that time, I was working on the financial services side of the business, and happened to work on a big IT project with a bank that was doing cross-border payments. So I was exposed to the gnarly reality of how money moves between countries. And banks are really interesting places because they're like essentially software companies that are in complete denial that they're software companies. Because that's like everything that's done at a bank relies on software. But if you talk to the leadership, they probably wouldn't kind of see themselves that way. So if one interesting way to learn about banking and finance is to work on the software side of it, because you actually get to see the mechanics of how everything happens, instead of just like living, working through a Excel model of a deal or a pitch deck in PowerPoint. The actual mechanics of the thing, the guts of the business really do happen through the software. So I had an appreciation for how money moves across the world, and I became friends with Jed, and about a year after we became friends, we actually started talking about what he was doing. And he was like, I just kind of knew him as like, oh, he's one of those Bitcoin guys. And then he was kind of talking about the way he had like designed this thing he was working on, and as he was talking about it, I was like, holy shit, like this is the thing. Like this is the thing that's going to replace all that nonsense I was working on. Like it's the obvious like design pattern that you need to like decentralize all these payment systems. And it just made a ton of sense. So very serendipitous that I happened to work in a side of the market which I was exposed to this, and then it just happened to kind of run into Jed here in San Francisco. So a little serendipity of life, I guess.
Right. So Jed's still actively involved with the project, and he's based in San Francisco, right?
Yep, he's bouncing around Korea this week, but yeah, normally based here.
Right. He just seems to pop up in lots of different places.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Well, thanks a lot, Brit. I think we're bumping up against the end of our time limit there. But for anyone who's really interested in this, where should they go to find out more?
Oh, you should definitely go to stellar.org if you want to just kind of check out the basics. I also recommend heading to our subreddit. We've gotten a lot more engagement over the past 6 months or so on the subreddit. So if you're a Redditor, even if you're not, I definitely recommend it. It's definitely a cool community, and they've got kind of all the relevant links in the sidebar. And if you have questions, there's folks there that can answer. So it's just like Reddit/r/stellar. Definitely recommend dropping in there and just getting to know the community and whatever everyone's up to.
Cool, and that's Stellar, Stellar, not the girl's name.
You got it.
All right, cool. Okay, thanks a lot, Brit. And you've been listening to Automata with John Southurst and Daniel Corey. For all the latest crypto and tech news, check out bitsonline.com. And Daniel's co-founder and CEO of Pactum Capital, cryptocurrency derivatives firm. And that's at pactumcapital.com. We'll be back soon with another report from the crypto economy. Always remember this: the future is automated. See you next time. Bye-bye.